Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're tackling something you deal with every single day, whether you realize it or not.
Sounds intriguing.
It's friction.
Ah, friction.
Yeah, it's the reason why that book on your desk doesn't just go flying off with the slightest nudge, or why you don't end up flat on your face every time you go for a walk.
It's true. Friction is always working behind the scenes, constantly resisting any motion between surfaces. Like, imagine you're trying to push a big, heavy box across a rough floor.
Okay,
You're
yeah.
putting in the effort, applying force, but there's this pushback, this resistance.
Yeah.
That's a friction, putting on the brakes, saying, hold on.
So it's kind of like that friend who always has to play devil's advocate, always pushing back, no matter what you suggest. But does the type of surface even matter? Like, would it be easier to push that box on ice compared to, say, carpet?
Absolutely. The surfer plays a huge role. There was a study where they dragged a brick across different surfaces, and the results were fascinating.
Okay, tell me more.
Moving that brick across a rough surface, like a bare floor, took way more force than pulling it across something smoother, like cloth.
Right, so rougher surfaces, more friction. Makes sense.
Yeah.
But why is that? What's going on at a microscopic level?
Well, picture this. Even surfaces that seem perfectly smooth actually have these tiny bumps and grooves when you zoom in really close.
Ah, okay.
So when those surfaces rub together, those tiny irregularities kind of get caught on each other, creating resistance. And the rougher the surface, the more of those bumps and grooves, the more they interlock and the more friction you end up with.
So it's kind of like trying to walk through a super crowded room. The more packed it is, the harder it is to move around.
Exactly. And that's why things like the soles of your shoes or car tires have those grooves and treads.
Oh, wait.
They're there to increase friction, give you a better grip, and hopefully prevent you from slipping and sliding all over the place.
So friction can actually be a good thing. Like, it's essential for, walking or driving safely.
Uh-huh.
But I'm guessing there are times when we really don't want all that friction.
Of course. Friction can be a bit of a double-edged sword. While it's super important for so many things we do every day, it can also be a real pain.
Yeah, totally.
Think about wrestling with a rusty old door. All that friction makes it a real struggle. Or imagine trying to zoom down a slide that's covered in sand.
Ouch. Not the best.
Not fun at all.
And I'm betting friction is behind that annoying squeaking sound coming from my bike chain. Speaking of which, how do we actually reduce friction when we need to?
Ah, good question. One way is to use lubricants. Think of things like oil, grease, or even graphite.
Okay.
They basically create this thin, slippery layer between surfaces, reducing those tiny microscopic interactions and letting things move a lot smoother.
So it's kind of like spreading butter between two slices of bread. They'll slide past each other much more easily.
Hmm.
But what about situations where you can't or shouldn't use lubricants? Is there another way to reduce friction?
There is, and this one is truly revolutionary. It's the idea of rolling.
Rolling.
Think about it. Rolling a heavy object is so much easier than trying to drag or slide it.
That's true.
And that's because rolling friction is way less than sliding friction.
Ah, that makes sense. And that's where the invention of the wheel comes in. Seriously, who was the genius who first thought of that? Because it's completely changed the world.
It really has. That simple invention, the wheel, transformed human civilization. It all boils down to minimizing friction by turning sliding motion into rolling motion. We see it everywhere. Cars, bicycles, conveyor belts, even ball bearings in machines.
Amazing how something so, simple can have such a huge impact. Makes you realize just how much we depend on reducing friction in our daily lives.
Absolutely. And speaking of things we rely on, we can't forget about friction in fluids. Think about how fish swim through water or how airplanes fly through the air.
Okay, yeah.
They encounter resistance from those fluids, and that's the type of friction we call drag.
So it's like the fluid itself is creating friction, even though it's not a solid surface. But if you think about it, both liquids and gases are made up of, tiny particles. So I guess it makes sense that they could still interact and create resistance.
Exactly. And this fluid friction, it's incredibly important when we design things that need to move through air or water. Nature, actually, has given us some fantastic examples of how to minimize drag. Ever notice the sleek, streamlined shapes of birds and fish?
Oh, of course. It's what makes them so graceful and efficient when they move.
Precisely. And we humans have learned a lot from those designs. Think of the aerodynamic shapes of airplanes and cars. They're designed to minimize drag and improve speed and fuel efficiency.
Wow, it's incredible how we keep finding these connections between friction, nature, and human ingenuity. It's this constant back and forth between pushing back and figuring out how to move forward smoothly.
It really is. And that brings us to a really interesting question. What would a world without any friction look like?
Ooh, that's a good one. Let me think about that for a second.
Take your time. It's a question with some pretty surprising consequences. So, we're talking about different kinds of friction. Let's start with static friction. It's the force that stops an object from moving when it's just sitting there.
Oh, okay. So that's why it takes some effort to get a heavy box moving in the first place. It's like static friction is holding it in place until you use enough force to overcome it.
Exactly. And once the object is moving, then we're talking about kinetic friction. That's the force that works against the motion of something that's already moving.
Okay, so static friction is that initial push you need to get past, and then kinetic friction is that constant resistance you feel as you keep pushing. Interesting. But why is there even a difference between those two types of friction?
Well, it all goes back to those microscopic interactions we were talking about.
Right.
When an object is at rest, those tiny little bumps and grooves have more time to really settle in and interlock, creating stronger connections. But once the object starts moving, those connections are constantly breaking and reforming, so you get a slightly lower frictional force.
That makes sense. It's like, think about trying to pull apart two pieces of Velcro. It takes more force to separate them when they're completely stuck together compared to when they're already partially pulled apart.
That's a great way to put it. And this difference between static and kinetic friction is something we see all the time. Think about driving a car.
Okay, yeah.
When you hit the brakes, it's the static friction between the brake pads and the rotors that stops the car. But if you slam on the brakes and the wheels lock up, then you're dealing with kinetic friction, which isn't as good at stopping you.
Ah, that's why anti-lock braking systems are so important. They keep the wheels from locking up and make sure you've got that stronger static friction to stop more effectively. Amazing how much physics is involved in just, driving.
It really is. Speaking of physics, let's take a closer look at what's going on with friction at the molecular level. It's more than just those bumps and grooves on the surface. There are all sorts of complex things going on between the atoms and molecules of the materials themselves.
So it's not just how rough or smooth things feel. The actual chemicals in the materials matter too.
Exactly. Things like chemical bonding, electrostatic forces, even the way molecules vibrate all affect how much friction there is between two surfaces.
Wow, that's getting pretty complicated. I'm starting to realize friction is a lot more involved than I thought.
It is. And there's still a lot we're learning. Scientists are constantly working on new materials and coatings that can reduce friction even further. That's leading to all kinds of new things in a lot of fields.
Yeah, I can see how this kind of knowledge could be useful everywhere.
Mhm.
Designing more efficient engines, coming up with new lubricants, maybe even making surfaces super slippery or super grippy, depending on what you need.
Exactly. And think about nanotechnology, where we're working with things at the atomic level. Figuring out friction on that scale could lead to some incredible breakthroughs.
This is really making me look at the world in a whole new way. It's like friction is this hidden force that's shaping everything, from the tiniest interactions between atoms to how planets move.
That's a great way to think about it. It really is. And we're only just starting to understand it all. Every new discovery leads to even more possibilities and new things to explore.
Well, speaking of exploring, we were talking about fluid friction or drag earlier. You mentioned how the shape of birds and fish are designed to minimize drag as they move. How does that actually work?
It's all about streamlining. A streamlined shape smoothly guides the flow of fluid around it, which reduces turbulence and resistance.
So it's like the fluid just kind of glides over the surface without causing much disturbance. But how do you get that kind of shape? What makes something more or less aerodynamic?
A few things are important. One is to reduce the frontal area. That's the amount of surface facing the oncoming flow. That's why race cars and fighter jets are so narrow and pointed at the front. They're trying to cut through the air with as little resistance as possible.
Right, so it's like presenting a smaller target for the air to push against. But I'm guessing it's more than just having a pointy front.
You're right. Another key thing is to make a smooth, gradual curve from the front to the back. That helps the fluid flow smoothly over the surface without breaking away and creating those little whirlpools of air, that turbulence.
So it's like the fluid follows the shape instead of getting caught on sharp edges or sudden changes.
Precisely. And the smoother that transition is, the less drag you have. Think about the difference between a golf ball and a perfectly smooth ball that's the same size.
Okay.
The golf ball with all those dimples actually has less drag. Those dimples create a thin layer of turbulent air really close to the surface, and that helps the main flow of air stay attached longer.
Wait, really? I would have thought the smooth ball would cut through the air better. But those little dimples actually make a difference.
They do. It shows that even small changes to the shape can have a big impact on how things move through fluids.
Wow, fascinating. So we've been talking about minimizing drag for things like airplanes and cars. But are there ever situations where you actually want more drag?
There are. Think about parachutes. They're designed to have a lot of drag, so they slow down a falling object. Or take those spoilers you see on race cars.
Oh, right.
They actually increase drag to push the car down onto the track, which helps with grip and handling at high speeds.
So it's not always about getting rid of drag. It's about controlling it, using it to get what you want. This is really making me think about how complex fluid dynamics is.
It is. And it all ties back to the idea of friction, as we've been discussing.
Mhm.
Whether we're talking about solid surfaces or fluids, friction is always there, shaping how things move and interact with each other.
This deep dive into friction has been so eye-opening. We've covered so much, from those basic ideas about friction on surfaces to all the complexities of fluid dynamics. I'm seeing friction everywhere now, and I really get how important it is for how everything works.
That's great to hear. And there's still so much more we could explore. We could look at the history of friction research, how we measure friction, or even how it plays a role in things like geology and astronomy.
Wow, it seems like the possibilities are endless. I'm definitely feeling inspired to keep learning and exploring this topic.
That's the spirit. There's always something new to discover. But for now, let's take a moment to think about everything we've learned about friction and how much it impacts our world.
Wow, we've really gone deep into the world of friction, haven't we?
We have. From everyday things like squeaky doors to the amazing science behind how things move through air and water.
It's incredible how something we experience all the time can be so complex. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of this force that we usually don't even think about.
One of the most important things to remember is that friction isn't good or bad on its own. It all comes down to the situation.
That's true. Sometimes we need more of it, like when you're walking on ice and don't want to slip, or when you need to brake quickly in your car.
Exactly. And other times, it's all about reducing friction as much as possible, like designing a high-speed train or a really efficient engine.
It's about finding that perfect balance where friction helps us instead of working against us.
You got it. That's what makes studying friction so interesting. We're always trying to understand it better, control it, and use it to our advantage.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away about friction?
I think it's realizing that friction is literally everywhere, affecting almost everything we do. From
Yeah.
the way we walk to how machines work to how things move through water or air, friction is always there.
It's like this invisible force shaping our reality, often without us even noticing.
And by understanding friction, we can appreciate how complex it is, how challenging it can be, and all the incredible possibilities it holds.
Couldn't agree more. It's a force that can both hold us back and give us power. As we keep exploring the world, I'm sure we'll discover even more secrets about this amazing phenomenon.
Oh, I have no doubt about that.
Well, to all our listeners, I encourage you to pay more attention to friction in your own lives. Notice how it affects the way you move, the objects you use, how things interact. It's a whole hidden world just waiting to be explored.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive has sparked some new questions for you. How could friction play a role in future technology, space travel, or even the microscopic world?
Those are some great questions. And remember, the journey of discovery doesn't stop here. There's always more to learn, explore, and wonder about.
So keep diving deep, keep those questions coming, and never lose your curiosity.
And until next time, happy exploring.